All right, today we're going to dive into one of the most powerful and maybe a little misunderstood concepts in modern web development, server and client components in Next.js. We're going to break down what they are, how they actually work, and most importantly, how you can use them to build apps that are both ridiculously fast and super interactive. So let's start with the big question, right? The one that developers have been wrestling with for years. How in the world do we build websites that load in the blink of an eye, but also have all that rich app-like stuff that users love? Clicks, state changes, smooth animations, the works. Because for the longest time, this has been a massive trade-off. It's been one or the other. On one side, you've got fast load times. You get those by doing most of the work on a server and just sending down plain HTML. On the other side, you have rich interactivity, but that requires shipping a whole bunch of JavaScript to the browser, which almost always slows down that initial page load. You could have one, or you could have the other, but getting both, that was the dream. And that right there, that brings us to our first section, the modern web's dilemma, that fundamental tug of war between speed and interactivity. But here's the thing, what if you didn't have to choose? What if you could get that lightning-fast server-rendered speed and all that dynamic client-side magic, all in one seamless package? Well, that's exactly the promise we're talking about today. Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, Meet Server and Client Components. These two concepts are the absolute key to solving our dilemma. First up, server components. Now, by default, in the Next.js app router, everything you write is a server component. The best way to think about these, they're like the kitchen of a restaurant. This is where all the heavy lifting happens, way behind the scenes, away from the customer. You're fetching data, talking to your database, using your secret API keys. It's all done securely on the server. None of this code ever gets sent to the browser. And then you have client components. So if the server is the kitchen, the client is the dining room. This is where you interact directly with the user. If you need a button to be clickable, or a state to change when someone types, or an animation to run, you need a client component. And you have to specifically opt in for this by adding one simple line at the very top of your file. Use client. Okay, so when do you actually use one versus the other? This little table here is basically your cheat sheet. For stuff like fetching data or touching your secret keys, you're always going to use a server component. It's just safer and more efficient. But for anything interactive, like an on-click handler or using state with useState, you have to use a client component. It's as simple as that. Okay, so we know what they are. Now let's see how they actually work together in Section 3, the journey of a request. We're going to follow it all the way from the server to the browser. It all happens in a few key steps. First, the server does its rendering magic. Then the client gets a super fast HTML preview. After that, the client hydrates the page. And finally, boom, the app becomes fully interactive. Let's dig into a couple of those a little deeper. During that first step on the server, React creates this really clever thing called the React Server Component Payload, or RSC payload. Now, this isn't just plain old HTML. It's a super efficient, compact description of the UI. It includes the finished output of your server components, but it also has these little placeholders that tell the browser, hey, a client component is supposed to go right here. And that brings us to this, well, kind of magical moment called hydration. The browser gets that plain, non-interactive HTML first, so the user sees something on the screen almost instantly. Then the JavaScript for your client components loads in the background and hydrates that static HTML. It attaches all the event listeners and brings the page to life. It's kind of like a store mannequin suddenly waking up and starting to talk to you. That's when your client components wake up. All right, enough theory. Let's get practical. Section 4 is a practical user's guide packed with tips and best practices for actually using these components in your code. This is probably the single most important rule to get right, understanding the client boundary. The second you put use client at the top of a file, you're drawing a line in the sand. That component and every single thing it imports is now officially part of the client world. It's all getting bundled up and sent to the browser. And because of that boundary, here is the golden rule. Keep your client components as small and as far down the component tree as you can. For example, if you have a huge page layout, but only one tiny search bar inside it needs to be interactive, please do not make the entire layout a client component. Just make the search bar its own tiny component, put use client in that file, and you're good. This is how you keep your JavaScript bundles lean and your app incredibly fast. So let's talk about a super common pattern. How do you get data from more secure server component into your interactive client component? It's actually really simple. You just pass it down as props. Your server component does the secure data fetching and then it hands that data off to the client component just like you would with any other prop. But, and this is a big but, there's a catch. The props you pass have to be serializable. That's a fancy word that just means you can only pass simple data like text, numbers, or plain objects. You can't pass complex things like functions or date objects directly from the server to the client. They just don't survive the trip. Okay, let's level up. Section 5 is all about mastering some of the more advanced patterns that really unlock the power of this whole architecture. Now, this pattern is incredibly powerful. It's called interleaving. You can literally pass a server component as a child to a client component. Think about a modal pop-up. The modal itself, the open/close logic, the background overlay, that's a client component. But the content inside the modal, that could be a server component that fetches data. This creates a slot for server-rendered content inside your interactive client UI. It's amazing. What about something like React Context, maybe for a theme provider? Well, since context only works in client components, the pattern is pretty straightforward. You just create your provider in its own file, mark it with use client, and then in your server-side layout, you wrap your components with that provider. That way your server can still render the layout, but all the client components nested inside can access the context. Oh, you are going to run into this one all the time. You install some awesome package from NPM, but it uses useState, and of course, the author hasn't added the useClient directive yet. The fix is super easy. Just create your own tiny wrapper component, import the library component there, add useClient to the top of your file, and then just use your wrapper component everywhere. Problem solved. And for safety, you can use these special packages. Think of them as your code's bodyguards. The server-only package will literally cause a build error if you accidentally try to import a file with, say, your secret API keys into a client component. It's a fantastic safeguard. And the same thing goes for the client-only package, for code that absolutely needs browser APIs, like the window object. So when you put it all together, you see how this architecture just completely solves that core dilemma we started with? You get the raw performance of server rendering and the rich, fluid experience of a single-page application, all without those old trade-offs. It's a genuine paradigm shift in how we build for the web. You truly have the best of both worlds at your fingertips. So the only real question left is, what are you going to build with it?